I did not think. I just threw the shoe. The ballroom was full of lords, ladies, powdered wigs, and polished smiles, and I stood there in the middle of it all, with one bare foot, and my heart hammering so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. He had humiliated me, right there, in front of everyone. His Grace, the Duke of Ashenvale, the most feared and desired man in all of London, had looked me dead in the eye, curled his perfect lip, and said, "Who let the seamstress into my ballroom?" The laughter hit me like a wave, cold, sharp. Every single face in that gilded room turned toward me, and not one of them held any kindness. So I reached down, slipped off my shoe, and threw it directly at his face. But it did not hit his face. It landed at his feet. And what happened next is what changed everything. He did not shout or call for guards. He did not even flinch. He bent down slowly, picked up my shoe, and brought it to his nose. He sniffed it. Then he looked up at me with those dark, dangerous eyes, and the corner of his mouth pulled into the most terrifying smirk I had ever seen in my life. He handed it to the man beside him and said, "Quiet and smooth as silk, track her down." I ran. But something tells me a girl cannot outrun a duke. Not this one. Not when he is already looking at you like you are the most interesting thing he has seen in years. And now I am wondering, was throwing that shoe the worst mistake of my life? Or the beginning of something I never saw coming? If you already know this duke is trouble, drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. I ran out of that ballroom with one shoe on my foot and shame burning so hot in my chest I thought it would set my dress on fire. The cold night air hit me the moment I burst through the side door, and I gasped like a woman who had been held under water. My bare foot met the stone steps and the chill shot straight up my leg, but I did not stop. I could not stop. Behind me, I could still hear the laughter. I could still hear his voice, low, smooth, unbothered, like a man who had never once in his life been caught off guard. Track her down. 2 words. That was all he had said. 2 words, and yet they chased me harder than any pair of boots ever could. My name is Thomasine Brewster, and until tonight, I was nobody important. I was the daughter of a widowed tailor on Calloway Lane, a girl who sewed buttonholes for women who would never once look me in the eye, a girl who had spent her entire life pressing her nose to the glass of a world that was never meant for her. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be the one night that changed everything. My employer, Mrs. Prudence Galloway, had sent me to the Ashenvale Ball to deliver a gown, a last-minute alteration for Lady Dunmore, who had torn her hem in a carriage, and sent 3 frantic notes to our shop before sundown. Mrs. Galloway could not go herself because her gout had flared up something terrible, and so she had thrust the wrapped gown into my arms, pressed 2 coins into my palm, and told me to use the servant's entrance, deliver the gown, and leave without touching anything. I had fully intended to do exactly that. But the servant's entrance had been locked, and the footman who was supposed to meet me had forgotten entirely. And I had stood in the cold for 20 minutes before a kind kitchen maid named Dottie took pity on me and led me through the back corridors of Ashenvale House, whispering directions so fast I only caught half of them. I took a wrong turn. I ended up in the ballroom, and the moment I stepped through that curtained archway with a gown box in my arms and confusion written plainly across my face, the music stopped. Not because of me, I would learn later. The orchestra had simply reached the end of a set, but in that silence, every single head in that glittering room turned, and I was standing there like a deer that had wandered into a dining room. I should have turned around immediately. I know that now. But Lady Dunmore spotted the gown box and cried out across the room, "Oh, thank heavens, the girl is here!" And suddenly, there was no going back. I walked forward. I kept my chin up because Mrs. Galloway had always said, the moment you drop your chin in a room full of people who do not respect you, you have already lost. So I walked, and I handed the box to Lady Dunmore's maid, and I turned to leave, and that was when I heard it. His voice. Who let the seamstress into my ballroom? It was not loud. That was what made it so awful. He did not need to shout. His voice simply carried, the way only the voices of men who have never once been ignored can carry, and the words landed on me like a bucket of ice water poured from a great height. I stopped walking. I turned around. He was standing near the fireplace, a glass of something dark in his hand, one arm resting on the mantel like he owned the entire world, which, in a sense, he did. The Duke of Ashenvale. I had heard of him the way you hear of storms before they arrive. People in our part of London spoke his name carefully, like it might bite. He had inherited the dukedom at 19, after his father died, under circumstances that nobody discussed openly. He was now 28, and he was the kind of handsome that made you angry, because it seemed deeply unfair for a man so cruel to also be so beautiful. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and that mouth, that horrible, perfect mouth, curved at the corner in something that was not quite a smile. He was looking right at me, and the laughter had already started, rippling through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Ladies behind their fans, gentlemen into their drinks. Even the musicians seemed to be smiling. Something inside me, some small and quiet thing that had been patient for a very long time, snapped. My hand moved before my brain did. I reached down, pulled off my shoe, and I threw it. It was not my finest moment. I am fully aware of that. The shoe sailed across the ballroom in a long, rather graceful arc, and it landed at his feet with a sharp little clap against the marble floor. Not at his face, where I had aimed, at his feet. The room went absolutely silent. He looked down at the shoe. He looked up at me. And then he did the thing that haunts me even now as I run through the cold, dark garden with my bare foot going numb on the stone path. He crouched down, slow and deliberate, like a man who had all the time in the world. He picked up the shoe. He turned it over in his hands once, studying it the way a collector might study a rare and interesting artifact. And then he raised it to his face, and he sniffed it. Not quickly, not as a joke, slowly, deliberately, with his eyes still on mine. Then he handed it to the man standing beside him, a tall fellow with red hair and the expression of someone who had learned long ago to show no reaction to anything his master did. And he said, calm as Sunday morning, "Track her down." I ran. I am still running now. The garden path curves ahead of me, and I can see the iron gate at the far end, the one that leads out onto the lane. And if I can just reach it, if I can just get through it and disappear into the ordinary dark of the city, then perhaps this night will become nothing more than a story I tell no one for the rest of my life. I reach the gate. I grab the iron bars. I pull. Locked. Of course, it is locked. I spin around, pressing my back against the cold iron, and I look back toward the house. The light from the ballroom window spills gold across the garden, and I can see shapes moving inside, shadows against the glass. And for one wild moment, I think I am safe. I think no one is coming. I think I have imagined all of it. Then the side door opens, And out steps the man with the red hair. He is holding my shoe. He looks directly at me, and he smiles. His name, I would later learn, was Mr. Callum Ventry, and he was the Duke's personal secretary, closest companion, and, according to the kitchen maid Dottie, who told me everything in a breathless whisper the following morning, the only human being alive that the Duke of Ashenvale actually trusted. But I did not know any of that yet. At that moment, standing with my back against the locked garden gate and one bare foot going completely numb, all I knew was that he was walking toward me, with my shoe in his hand and a look on his face that was not unkind, but was entirely too calm for the situation. "Miss Brewster," he said. I stared at him. "How do you know my name?" "Lady Dunmore's maid." She was quite forthcoming. He stopped a few feet away and held out the shoe. "His Grace would like a word." "His Grace," I said, "can want whatever he likes. I am leaving. The gate is locked." I noticed. He tilted his head slightly. There was something almost amused in his expression, though he kept it very carefully contained. "Miss Brewster, I understand this evening has been unpleasant, but refusing will only make things more complicated. More complicated than being humiliated in front of 300 people and then hunted through a garden?" He had no answer for that, or rather, he chose not to give one. He simply extended the shoe again, patient as a man who had learned that patience was usually faster than force, and I snatched it out of his hand and shoved it back onto my foot with as much dignity as I could manage, which was very little. He led me back through the side door and into a narrow corridor lined with dark wood paneling and oil paintings of men who all seemed to share the same expression of deep disapproval. My heart was hammering. My hands were cold. I kept my chin up because I could hear Mrs. Galloway's voice in my head, and also because I refused to let anyone in this house see me afraid. We stopped in front of a door. Mr. Ventry knocked once, then opened it and stepped aside. I walked in. The study was large and warm, lit by a fire that had been burning long enough to fill the room with deep orange light. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling. A desk sat near the window, heavy and dark, covered in papers and sealed letters. And behind the desk, still in his evening clothes, still with that glass of dark liquid in his hand, sat the Duke of Ashenvale. He looked up when I entered. He did not stand. He did not greet me. He simply looked at me for a long moment the way you might look at something unexpected that has landed on your windowsill, with curiosity and a kind of careful assessment. "Sit down," he said. "I prefer to stand." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something else. Interest, perhaps, though I did not want to call it that. "As you like." He set down his glass. "You threw your shoe at me. You humiliated me in front of your entire ballroom. I asked a question. You announced me like I was something that had crawled in from the gutter." The fire cracked and shifted. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You have a great deal of nerve for a seamstress. You have a great deal of cruelty for a duke." The silence that followed that sentence was the longest of my life. I could feel my own pulse in my throat. I watched his face for the explosion I was certain was coming, for the cold command, for the threat, for the dismissal. Men like him did not tolerate being spoken to that way. Everyone knew that, but he did not explode. He leaned back in his chair, and very slowly, he smiled. It was not the smirk from the ballroom. This was something different, smaller, almost involuntary, like something that had escaped before he could stop it. "Sit down, Miss Brewster," he said again. "Please." I sat. He rose from behind the desk and moved to the fireplace, standing with his back to me for a moment, one hand on the mantel. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Still controlled, still precise, but the edge of performance was gone from it. "The gown you delivered tonight," he said. "Did you make it?" I blinked. Of all the things I had expected him to say, I altered it. The original construction was someone else's work. But the embroidery on the sleeve, the small flowers at the cuff, that was yours? I looked at him carefully. Yes, it was exceptional. He turned to look at me over his shoulder. "I noticed it when Lady Dunmore came in, before I noticed you." Campton, I did not know what to do with that. I filed it away and kept my expression still. "Thank you." He turned fully now and came back toward the desk, not sitting, but standing behind it, and he looked at me with that same careful assessment from before. "Who trained you?" "My father. He was a tailor for 20 years before his hands failed him." "And now you work for Mrs. Galloway?" "Yes." "For how long?" 4 years. He nodded slowly, like he was cataloging information. Like this was an interview, and I did not yet know what position was being discussed. The fire behind him threw his shadow long across the floor, and in that orange light he looked less like a weapon and more like a man, which was somehow more unsettling. "I owe you an apology," he said. Everything in me went still. "My remark in the ballroom was careless," he continued, and his voice carried no warmth, but it carried something I did not expect, something close to genuine. "It was not directed at you specifically, but that does not make it less offensive. And you deserved better than that in my home." I stared at him. "Are you actually apologizing to me?" "I am. Dukes do not apologize to seamstresses. This one does when he is wrong." The quiet that followed was completely different from the quiet before. This one had texture to it, weight. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and the fire between us made the whole room feel smaller and closer than it actually was. I should have stood up. I should have thanked him briefly, kept my dignity intact, and walked out of that house and never looked back. That is what a sensible woman would have done. That is what Mrs. Galloway would have done, gout and all. Instead, I said, "Why did you smell my shoe?" He blinked. For just one fraction of a second, the Duke of Ashenvale looked genuinely caught off guard. Then, the composure returned, smooth and instant, as a mask sliding back into place. But I had seen it. That one unguarded second. I tucked it away like a secret. "A habit," he said. "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." He sat down now, slowly, and picked up his glass again and looked at the fire. "My mother used to say that you can tell everything about a person by the things they leave behind. Their handwriting, their footprints, the smell of the places they have walked through." He paused. "She was eccentric." "She sounds wonderful," I said, before I could stop myself. He looked at me then, and something moved behind his eyes. Something deep and unreadable and a little bit painful. "She was," he said quietly. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Somewhere in the house, music was still playing, muffled by walls and distance, and the sound of it made the study feel like a world apart, like a room outside of time. Then the door opened. The woman who entered was tall and narrow-shouldered, with silver threaded through her dark hair and eyes that swept the room like searchlights. She was perhaps 50, dressed beautifully, carrying herself with the specific confidence of someone who has never once been told no. She looked at the Duke, then at me, and her expression sharpened the way a blade sharpens on stone. "Dorian," she said, "what on earth is going on? Half the ballroom is talking about a shoe." So that was his name, Dorian, the Duke of Ashenvale. I had not known his given name, until that moment. He stood when she entered. Aunt Harriet. Do not Aunt Harriet me. Who is this girl? Miss Thomasine Brewster. She delivered Lady Dunmore's gown this evening. His aunt, Lady Harriet Fenwick, looked at me with the full force of her considerable attention. I had been looked at by difficult women before. Mrs. Galloway could strip paint with a glance when she chose to, but Lady Harriet was something else entirely. She was the kind of woman who had learned that the fastest way to make someone feel small was simply to look at them like they already were. I stood up. I straightened my spine. I looked back. Something flickered across her face. Not warmth, but something approaching respect. Or at least the consideration of it. Why is she still here? She asked, directing the question at her nephew. I asked her to stay, he said. I owed her an apology. Lady Harriet's eyes moved between us like a woman watching a chess match and already calculating who was going to lose. An apology. She said the word as if she was testing its weight. Dorian, there is a ballroom full of guests who are telling very entertaining stories about you sniffing a shoe. Let them. There is also, she continued, her voice dropping to something more precise, a Miss Portia Wyndham in that ballroom whose father has been very patiently waiting 2 seasons for you to show any interest in anyone. And I would strongly suggest that your time would be better spent, Aunt Harriet. She stopped. Good night, he said. The silence between them was the silence of 2 people who had been having the same argument for years, and both knew exactly how it ended. Lady Harriet looked at me one more time, and this time her expression was not hostile. It was something closer to warning. Then she turned, straight-backed and elegant, and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind her. The Duke sat back down. He looked at the door for a moment, then at me, and there was something exhausted in his face that he did not bother to hide. I apologize for her as well, he said. You apologize a great deal for a man with such a terrifying reputation. You may go, Miss Brewster. Mr. Ventry will see you out through the front door. He paused. The front door, not the servants' entrance. I stood and smoothed my skirt. I looked at him one last time, this complicated and infuriating man sitting in his warm study full of books, and I said, For what it is worth, Your Grace, your mother sounds like she was the most interesting person in your family. He did not smile, but his eyes softened, just for a moment. She was, he said, by a considerable distance. I walked out. Mr. Ventry was waiting in the corridor, and he led me through the grand entrance hall, past the marble floors and the towering portraits, and the last few guests drifting out into the night with their cloaks and their gossip. He opened the front door for me, and the night air came in cool and clean. Miss Brewster, he said quietly, as I stepped past him onto the top step. I turned. He was holding something out, a card, plain white, with an address written in clean dark ink. His Grace said to give you this, Mr. Ventry said. In case you are ever in need of work that matches your actual abilities. I took the card. I looked at it. I looked at Mr. Ventry, who offered me nothing further in the way of explanation. Then I walked down the steps and into the London night, with one shoe that had been sniffed by a duke, a card with an address I had not asked for, and the deeply inconvenient feeling that this evening was not an ending at all. It was the beginning, and somewhere behind those lit windows, I had the strangest certainty that he already knew it too. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my narrow bed above the shop on Calloway Lane and stared at the ceiling and turned the card over and over in my fingers until the edges went soft. The address written on it was in Mayfair, a street I had walked past 100 times but never had reason to enter. The kind of street where the brass door knockers were polished every single morning and the curtains in the windows cost more than my father earned in a year. I told myself I would not go. I told myself this firmly and with great conviction at approximately 2 in the morning, again at 4, and once more just before dawn when the city outside began its slow gray waking and the sound of cartwheels on cobblestone drifted up through my window. By 7, I was dressed. By 7:30, I was standing in front of Mrs. Galloway's desk with my hands folded and my expression carefully neutral, telling her everything that had happened the night before, except the part about the card, which I kept in my pocket and said nothing about, because I had not yet decided what it meant. Mrs. Galloway listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She was a small woman, round and sharp at the same time, like a button that had been pressed too hard, and she had a way of listening that made you feel every word you said was being weighed and measured and filed away for future use. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He sniffed your shoe." "Yes." "In front of 300 people." "Yes." "And then sent his man to fetch you." "Yes." She looked at me with eyes that had seen 40 years of women making decisions about men and living with the consequences. "Thomasine," she said, "that man is dangerous." "I know. Not dangerous the way a loose cobblestone is dangerous. Dangerous the way a current is dangerous. The kind you do not notice until it has already taken you somewhere you did not intend to go." I said nothing. She studied me for another long moment, then reached across her desk and picked up a letter that had been sitting there since before I arrived. She held it out to me. I took it. It was sealed with wax, dark red, pressed with a crest I recognized immediately because I had just spent half the night staring at a card bearing the same mark. I looked up at her. "It arrived this morning," she said. "Before 6. A footman brought it." I broke the seal. The letter was brief. 4 sentences, written in the same clean dark ink as the address on the card. It said that the Duke of Ashenvale was in need of a skilled embroiderer for a private commission. It said the work was delicate and time-sensitive. It said the compensation offered was 3 times the standard rate for work of this nature. And it said that if Miss Brewster was interested, she should present herself at the Mayfair address on the card by 10 o'clock that morning. It was signed not with his name but with a single initial, D. Mrs. Galloway was watching me read. When I looked up, she said nothing. She simply waited. "It is a commission," I said. "Embroidery work." "Is that what it is?" "That is what the letter says." She folded her hands on her desk. "The rate he is offering, I assume it is generous?" 3 times standard. She closed her eyes briefly, the way she did when she was calculating something she did not entirely want to calculate. When she opened them, she said, "You will go. You will do the work. You will take the money. And you will remember every single thing I have ever told you about men who look at women the way I suspect that man looked at you last night." I folded the letter carefully. "How do you know how he looked at me?" I did not describe it. "You did not have to," she said. "Go. Be back before dark." I went. The house in Mayfair was tall and white-fronted, set behind a low iron fence with stone urns on either side of the gate, and it was quieter than Ashenvale House, smaller, more private, the kind of house a man retreats to when he wants to be somewhere that is entirely his own. Mr. Ventry met me at the door. He seemed unsurprised to see me, which meant the Duke had been confident I would come, which annoyed me considerably. I was shown to a sitting room on the 2nd floor where a wooden frame had been set up near the window, and on it was stretched a piece of ivory silk the size of a tablecloth, already traced with a pattern in faint pencil lines. Flowers, intricate, delicate, clearly designed by someone who understood embroidery well enough to know what was difficult. Beside the frame was a case of threads, every color present, sorted with obsessive care. I stood looking at it for a moment, and despite everything, despite the irritation and the uncertainty, and Mrs. Galloway's warning still ringing in my ears, I felt the pull of it. The work was beautiful before it was even begun. It was my mother's design. I turned. He was standing in the doorway. No evening clothes this time. Plain dark trousers, a white shirt without a cravat. His sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked younger this way. Less like a portrait and more like a person. She drew it the year before she died, he continued, stepping into the room. She never had the chance to finish it. I have had 3 embroiderers attempt it in the past 2 years. None of them got it right. I turned back to the frame and looked at the pencil lines. I could see immediately what the others had likely done wrong. The pattern had a specific logic to it, a way the flowers grew into each other that required the stitcher to work from the center outward rather than in the conventional way. It was not immediately obvious unless you had been trained by someone who thought about fabric the way my father had taught me to think about it, as something alive, with grain and breath and intention. I can do this, I said. I know, he said. That is why you are here. I sat down and opened the thread case and began the way my father had always taught me, by simply touching the fabric first, learning its weight, its give, the way it moved under my fingers. I was so absorbed in this that I almost forgot he was still in the room until he spoke again. Miss Brewster. I looked up. He was standing near the window now, looking out at the street below, his hands clasped behind his back. I need to tell you something about why this commission is time-sensitive. Something in his voice made me set down the thread I was holding. He turned from the window. There is a woman, he said. Lady Portia Wyndham. You heard my aunt mention her last night. I remember. There is pressure on me to make an offer. Considerable pressure. From my aunt, from her father, from certain financial arrangements my own father made before he died that I am not at liberty to ignore entirely. He paused. The embroidery you are working on was intended as a gift. My mother made it for the woman she hoped I would one day choose freely, not the woman I am being arranged toward. The room felt very quiet. I am telling you this, he said, because I think you deserve to know the full situation before you invest your work in it. And what is the full situation, exactly? I asked. He looked at me steadily. That I am a man in a complicated position, asking a woman he has already treated badly once to do something that matters a great deal to him, and trying to be honest about it. Before I could respond, the door opened. Not Mr. Ventry this time. The man who walked in was perhaps 45, heavyset, with a broad face that might have been friendly under different circumstances, but was currently arranged into an expression of cold displeasure. He wore his wealth visibly, rings on 3 fingers, a watch chain thick as rope, a coat that cost more than my shop earned in a month. He looked at me the way you look at furniture that has been left in the wrong room. Then he looked at the Duke. Ashenvale, he said. Your man said you were occupied. I let myself in. I hope you will forgive the intrusion. The tone of his voice made it clear he did not particularly care whether the intrusion was forgiven or not. Lord Percival Wyndham, the Duke said, and his voice had changed completely. The warmth was gone. The walls were up. He was fully armored in an instant, and I watched the transformation happen so fast it frightened me. I was not expecting you today. Clearly, Lord Wyndham's eyes moved to me again, and this time they stayed. Who is this? an embroiderer, working on a private commission. Lord Wyndham walked further into the room, slow and deliberate. The walk of a man who considers every space he enters to be his own. He stopped near the frame and looked at the silk, then at me, and something shifted in his expression that I did not like at all. "Pretty work," he said, but he was not looking at the embroidery. I picked up my needle and said nothing. "I came to discuss the matter we spoke of last week," Lord Wyndham said, turning back to the Duke. "My daughter has been patient. I have been patient. But patience, as I have said before, is not without its limits." "We have discussed this," the Duke said. "I told you I needed time. And I told you that time is something the Wyndham family does not have in unlimited supply." Lord Wyndham's voice had not risen, but it had hardened, the way iron hardens when it cools. "The arrangement your father and I agreed upon was not a suggestion, Ashenvale. It was a binding understanding, one that I expect to see honored. My father's understandings are not automatically my own. The law would disagree with you." The two men looked at each other across the room, and the air between them was so tight it practically hummed. I kept my eyes on the silk, and my hands in my lap, and tried to make myself as invisible as possible, which was difficult given that Lord Wyndham's eyes kept sliding back to me with an interest that had nothing to do with embroidery. Then he said something that made my needle slip. "I heard an interesting story this morning," he said, his voice taking on a new texture, smooth and quiet and pointed as a letter opener. "About last night's ball, about a shoe," he paused, "and about the girl it belonged to." He looked at me directly. I met his gaze. I did not look away. "Interesting," he said softly, to no one in particular. Then he looked back at the Duke. "I will give you 2 weeks, Ashenvale. 2 weeks to do what your honor and your father's word require. After that, I will be forced to take measures that neither of us will enjoy." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes by any significant distance. "Good day." He walked out. The silence he left behind was loud and strange. I looked at the Duke. He was still standing exactly where he had been, but his jaw was tight, and there was something in his eyes, not fear exactly, but the look of a man who knows that the ground beneath him is less solid than it appears. "What did your father agree to?" I asked quietly. He looked at me. He seemed to consider whether to answer. "A debt," he said at last. "My father borrowed a very large sum from Lord Wyndham 20 years ago. The agreed repayment was not in money." He stopped. "It was you," I said. He said nothing, which was the answer enough. I looked down at the ivory silk, at the pencil lines of flowers that a dead woman had drawn for a future she hoped would be different from the one being arranged around her son. And for the first time since I had walked into this house, I felt something other than irritation and confusion and the complicated pull of a man I did not want to be pulled toward. I felt the first cold finger of real fear, because Lord Percival Wyndham had looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided how to solve. And I was not certain that I was ready for whatever that solution was. 3 days after Lord Wyndham walked out of the Mayfair house, someone broke into my shop. I came downstairs before dawn to find the front window cracked and the workroom turned inside out. Bolts of fabric pulled from shelves, thread cases overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor. Mrs. Galloway stood in the middle of it, in her dressing gown, with her candle held high and her face the color of old chalk. Nothing was taken. That was the part that frightened me most. A thief takes things. Whoever had come into our shop had not wanted anything we had. They had wanted us to know they had been there. I stood in the doorway of the workroom and looked at the mess and felt the message in it, clear as ink on paper. Mrs. Galloway looked at me over her candle flame. She did not ask me if I knew what this was about. She was too clever for that. She simply said, "Thomasine, what have you gotten us into?" I know. I did not have a clean answer for her. I had been going to the Mayfair house every morning for 3 days. The embroidery was coming along in a way that satisfied me deeply and unsettled me equally, because every hour I spent bent over that silk frame was an hour I spent in a house where the Duke of Ashenvale moved through rooms quietly and asked me careful questions about my father and my work and the way I had learned to see. Patterns in fabric, and every answer I gave him seemed to pull something tighter between us that I had no name for yet and was not sure I wanted to name. He was not what I had expected. He was not what anyone expected, I suspected, which was perhaps the whole point of the reputation. The coldness was real, but it was armor, and beneath it was a man who read poetry in the evenings and kept every letter his mother had ever written to him, tied with green ribbon in the top drawer of his desk, and felt the weight of his father's failures like a stone around. His neck, that he carried so quietly most people never noticed it was there. I noticed. That was the problem. I noticed everything, and the more I noticed, the harder it became to remember why I was supposed to keep a careful distance. But the broken window brought everything into sharp, cold focus. I sent a note to Mr. Ventry that morning rather than going myself, because I did not know who might be watching the shop, and I did not want to lead anyone directly to that door. The note said only that something had happened and I would be delayed. Mr. Ventry arrived at our shop within the hour. He assessed the workroom with the same unnerving calm he brought to everything. Asked Mrs. Galloway 3 quiet questions, looked at the cracked window from both inside and outside, and then came to stand beside me near the back door. "It was meant as a warning," he said. "I know. Lord Wyndham has people in most parts of the city," he said. "Men who watch and report. Men who do other things when watching and reporting is not sufficient." I looked at him. How long has he had someone watching me? "Since the night of the ball, we suspect." He paused. "You made yourself memorable, Miss Brewster." "I am aware of that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "His Grace would like you to come. Not to the Mayfair house. Somewhere safer." "Where?" He told me. It was a townhouse in a quieter part of the city, belonging to a widow named Mrs. Octavia Crane, who was Mr. Ventry explained in his careful way, an old friend of the Duke's mother, and one of the few people in London the Duke trusted, without reservation. She had been informed. She was expecting me. I could bring Mrs. Galloway if I felt it necessary for propriety. Mrs. Galloway, to her credit, did not argue. She packed a bag in 15 minutes, tucked her most important account books under her arm, and told her apprentice girl, a silent and efficient 14-year-old named Betts, to lock everything up and stay with her cousin until further notice. We arrived at Mrs. Crane's townhouse before noon. Octavia Crane was perhaps 60, with white hair pinned severely and kind eyes that contradicted the severity completely. She welcomed us into a sitting room full of mismatched furniture and the smell of good tea and something baking, and she shook my hand firmly and looked at me with the direct and assessing gaze of a woman who had been forming accurate opinions of people for 6 decades. "So you are the one who threw the shoe," she said. "I am." "Good," she said simply, and led us inside. The Duke arrived an hour later. He came in through the back without Mr. Ventry, which told me the situation had moved past the point where appearances mattered. He was still dressed well but quickly, like a man who had left somewhere in a hurry, and there was a tension around his eyes that had not been there 3 days ago. He looked at me first when he entered the room. then at Mrs. Galloway, who looked back at him with the full force of 40 years of careful female judgment. "Mrs. Galloway," he said, "I owe you an apology and a new window." She said, "You owe me considerably more than that, Your Grace, but the window is a start." Something like genuine respect crossed his face. He sat down. Mrs. Crane poured tea with the serenity of a woman who had hosted crises before and found them manageable with sufficient biscuits. "Wyndham has escalated," the Duke said. "I expected pressure. I did not expect him to move against people outside our direct circle this quickly." He looked at me. "I am sorry. This is because of your connection to me." "What connection?" I said. "I am embroidering a tablecloth." "Wyndham does not see it that way." "What does Wyndham see?" The Duke set down his cup. "He sees a woman who has my attention. And he knows, because he has known me since I was a boy, and he has never missed an opportunity to use knowledge as leverage, that my attention is not a common thing." He paused. "He is using you to pressure me. If I concede to his demands about Portia, the pressure on you stops. If I do not, it will escalate further." The room was quiet except for the fire. Mrs. Galloway said, very calmly, "And what are you intending to do?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands for a moment, then out the window, then at me. "There is a document," he said. "My father's original agreement with Wyndham. I have a solicitor named Mr. Alistair Price, who has been working quietly for the past 6 months to find a legal path through it. He believes the agreement contains a clause that was never properly registered, which would render the entire arrangement unenforceable." He paused. "But Wyndham knows about Price." "Yesterday, Price's office was also searched." Mrs. Galloway set down her cup with a small, precise click. I said, "Does Wyndham have the document?" "Not yet. Price moved it before they got there. It is safe. But Wyndham knows we are looking for a way out, and that is why he has stopped being subtle." "No." A knock at the door of the sitting room made everyone go still. Mrs. Crane rose, unruffled, and opened it. Standing in the doorway was a young woman I had not seen before. She was perhaps 20, fair-haired, with the kind of face that is so carefully arranged into pleasantness that you cannot immediately tell what lies underneath it. She was dressed for a morning call, neat and correct, and she looked at the room with wide eyes that took in every person present and missed nothing. "I am sorry to intrude," she said. Her voice was soft and precise. "I came to see Mrs. Crane. I did not know she had company." Mrs. Crane said, warmly but watchfully, "My dear, come in, everyone. This is Miss Portia Wyndham." The silence that followed was extraordinary in its density. Portia Wyndham's eyes moved from Mrs. Crane to the Duke, and something passed across her face, something quick and complicated, and not at all what I expected. It was not a triumph. It was not the expression of a woman who had tracked down the man she intended to marry. It looked much more like desperation. She looked at the Duke and said, "I need to speak with you, privately, please." She hesitated. "It is about my father and what he is planning to do next." The Duke rose slowly from his chair. I looked at Portia Wyndham, and she looked at me. And in that look was something I had not anticipated at all, a silent and urgent communication from a woman who was as trapped as I was beginning to feel, just trapped from the opposite direction. Whatever Lord Wyndham was planning, his own daughter was afraid of it, and she had come here to warn us. Portia Wyndham did not look like a woman who had come to cause trouble. She looked like a woman who had been carrying trouble for so long her arms had gone weak from the weight of it. Mrs. Crane closed the sitting room door quietly and guided her to a chair near the window. Portia sat down with the careful posture of someone who had been taught from childhood that how you hold your body in a room tells people everything about who you are. But her hands in her lap were trembling slightly, and no amount of good posture could hide that. The Duke stood near the fireplace. His face had gone very still in the way I had come to recognize. Not cold exactly, but closed, waiting, giving nothing away until he understood what was in front of him. Mrs. Galloway sat beside me on the small settee and said nothing, which was its own kind of eloquence. Portia looked at the Duke and said, "My father has a man. His name is Gideon Rake. He works quietly. He finds things, moves things, makes problems disappear. My father has used him for years, and most people in London do not even know he exists." She stopped, steadied herself. "Yesterday, my father told Mr. Rake to find the document your solicitor has been protecting. Not just to find it, to destroy it." The Duke said, "How do you know this?" "Because my father does not lower his voice when he speaks to Mr. Rake in his own study. And because the wall between my father's study and the music room is thinner than he has ever bothered to notice." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I have heard a great many things through that wall over the years. Most of them I have kept to myself because I had no reason and no means to do otherwise. But this is different." I looked at her. "Why is this different?" She turned to me, and in her eyes was something that answered the question before her mouth did. "Because I know what my father is. I have known for a long time. And I have been silent about it, because silence was the safest thing available to me." She exhaled. "But I will not be silent about this. If he destroys that document, the Duke is locked into an agreement he never chose, and I am forced into a marriage that neither of us wants, and my father gets everything he has been maneuvering toward for 20 years. Her voice had gone quieter, but not weaker. "I refuse to be the instrument of that." The room was very still. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, but genuinely. The careful distance he maintained from almost everyone softened slightly, and he said, "Miss Wyndham, I owe you an apology. I have thought of you in this situation as a circumstance rather than a person." "You were not wrong to," she said simply. "That is how my father has always treated me as well. It is a pattern I have grown quite used to." She said it without self-pity, which made it more painful to hear than if she had wept. Mrs. Crane, who had been sitting quietly with her tea and her careful eyes, spoke for the first time. "Then we must move quickly. If Gideon Rake has been instructed to find Mr. Price's document, he will not wait long. He is known to be efficient." "Where is the document now?" I asked, looking at the Duke. "Price moved it 2 days ago. I know the location, but I have not sent word to confirm it is still safe, because I did not want to draw attention to the address through any communication that could be intercepted." He looked at Mr. Ventry, who had slipped into the room at some point so quietly I had not noticed him arrive. "We need to get to Price." Mr. Ventry nodded once and was already moving toward the door. "Wait," Portia said. Everyone paused. She reached into the small bag on her wrist and drew out a folded piece of paper. She held it toward the Duke. "My father's man does not know I overheard him, but I listened long enough to hear him give Mr. Rake an address. I wrote it down." She paused. "I believe it is where he thinks the document already is. If you can get there first and move the document again before Rake arrives, it buys you time." The Duke crossed the room in 3 steps and took the paper from her hand. He read it. Something moved through his expression, fast and sharp. He looked at Mr. Ventry. "That is Price's sister's house. He moved it there. He told me last week, but I had forgotten." He folded the paper and put it in his coat. "Go now. Take Barlow with you." Mr. Ventry left without a word. His footsteps on the staircase were quick, and then gone, and the front door opened and closed, and silence settled back over the room. Portia folded her hands in her lap and said, very quietly, "What happens to me if this works? If the document is found unenforceable and the arrangement collapses, my father will know I helped. He will not be gentle about it." Mrs. Crane said, before anyone else could speak, "You will stay here for as long as necessary." She said it with the absolute certainty of a woman who understood that some decisions do not require deliberation. Your father will not come into my house uninvited. He knows better. Portia looked at her with something that was close to disbelief and even closer to relief. "You barely know me. I knew your mother, Mrs." Crane said. "She was a good woman in a very bad situation. I was not able to help her. I can help you." She stood and held out her hand. "Come, I will show you to a room." Portia rose. She looked at me once more before she followed Mrs. Crane out of the room, and in that look was an entire conversation that we did not need words for. Two women standing on different sides of the same impossible man, and neither of us the villain, and neither of us entirely safe. Then they were gone, and it was just the Duke and me and Mrs. Galloway and the fire going low in the grate. Mrs. Galloway stood, announced that she needed more tea and possibly something stronger, and excused herself to find the kitchen, which left me alone with him, and I was fairly certain she had done it deliberately. He stayed near the fireplace. I stayed on the settee. The space between us was not large, but it felt very specifically shaped, like something had been placed in it that neither of us wanted to disturb. "You are frightened," he said. "I am careful," I corrected. "There is a difference." "Is there?" "Frightened people freeze. Careful people keep thinking." I looked at him. "I am still thinking." He came and sat down in the chair across from me, and for a moment he said nothing. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor with the expression of a man taking inventory of everything that has gone wrong and everything that might still go wrong, and trying to find the one path that avoids both. "If Price's document holds," he said, "and the arrangement is dissolved, Wyndham will lose the one piece of leverage he has had over this family for 20 years. He looked up. "He will not accept it quietly. He will look for other ways to cause damage. I know. One of those ways will be you." His voice had gone careful and quiet and entirely direct. "He has already decided you are significant to me. He will use that." I looked at him steadily. "And am I significant to you?" The silence that answered that question was the longest one yet. He held my gaze, and in his eyes was everything he had been not saying for days. All the careful questions and the quiet moments by the embroidery frame, and the way he always seemed to find a reason to still be in whatever room I was in. It was all there, honest and unguarded. And I understood in that moment that this man who armored himself against the entire world simply did not know how to armor himself against me, and that was the most terrifying and wonderful thing I had ever been told without a single word. "Yes," he said. Just that. One word. And it landed somewhere in my chest and took root. Before either of us could say anything further, the sound of rapid footsteps on the front steps made us both go still. Then, Mr. Ventry's voice in the entrance hall, low and quick. And then he was in the doorway with a man I had not met before, slight and gray-haired and breathing hard, with a leather satchel clutched to his chest like it contained something precious. Mr. Alistair Price, the solicitor. He had come himself. "We got there first," Mr. Ventry said. "By perhaps 20 minutes. Rake's man was already on the street when we left." Price crossed to the table and opened the satchel and drew out a document, old paper. The ink faded to brown, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. He laid it flat and looked at the Duke with the expression of a man who has very good news and knows its full weight. "The clause," he said, pressing his finger to a line near the bottom of the document, "was never countersigned by the required third witness. Under the terms of the original conveyance, that makes it null. The entire financial agreement your father entered into is unenforceable." He looked up. "Lord Wyndham cannot compel anything. Not the marriage, not the money, nothing." The Duke looked at the document for a long moment. Then he sat back, and for the first time since I had known him, I watched the Duke of Ashenvale take a full, quiet breath of relief. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then the front door of Mrs. Crane's house opened without anyone knocking, and Lord Percival Wyndham walked in. He had 2 men with him, large and expressionless, and he walked through the entrance hall like he owned everything in it, and he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room with his eyes moving fast across every face in the room and landing finally on Mr. Price and the document on the table. His expression went very flat. "Wyndham," the Duke said, and his voice was perfectly level, "you are in someone else's home without permission. And you," Wyndham said, his gaze fixed on the paper, "are holding a document that is the property of an agreement between our families. It is a document that proves there is no valid agreement between our families," Price said, and his voice shook slightly, but he did not step back. "The clause is unwitnessed. I am prepared to file with the courts tomorrow morning." Wyndham looked at him with the cold patience of a man who has more than one way to solve a problem. "I would advise against that, Mr. Price." "And I," said a new voice from the doorway behind Wyndham, "would advise you to choose your next words with extraordinary care." Everyone turned. Standing in the entrance hall, having come through the front door that Wyndham had left open, was Lady Harriet Fenwick, the Duke's aunt. She was dressed as though she had come from somewhere important, which she probably had, and she was carrying herself with the particular ferocity of a woman who has decided to stop standing in the background of a situation. Behind her was another man I did not recognize, younger, with the careful bearing of someone official. He was carrying a leather folder, and he had the look of a man from the courts. Lady Harriet walked into the room without looking at Wyndham at all, which was its own kind of statement, and she said to her nephew, "Mr. Price sent word to me 2 hours ago. I have brought Mr. Dane from the registry office. He can witness and file the legal declaration today, immediately." Wyndham said, "Harriet, you are making a mistake." She looked at him then, and the look she gave him was so precise and so complete that one of the large, expressionless men behind him actually shifted his weight backward. "Percival," she said, "I have watched you hold this family in a trap for 20 years. I assisted in keeping the peace because I believed it was what was necessary. I was wrong, and I am correcting that now." She looked at Mr. Dane. "Please proceed." Wyndham looked at the Duke. His face had gone the color of old stone. "You will regret this." "My father regretted many things," the Duke said. "I intend to regret as little as possible." He paused. "You should leave. Mrs. Crane has asked for no visitors today." Wyndham stood very still for one long, heavy moment. Then he turned and walked out, his 2 men behind him, and the front door closed, and the air in the room seemed to become breathable again, all at once. Mr. Dane opened his folder. Mr. Price smoothed the document on the table. Lady Harriet stood at the window and watched the street below with narrow eyes until Wyndham's carriage had gone. I sat on the settee and held very still, and felt the whole enormous shape of the last hour settle around me. The Duke looked across the room at me. He did not smile, but his eyes said everything that the smile would have. The document was filed the following morning. By afternoon, the news had moved through certain parts of London with the quiet speed that legal matters move when they carry the weight of a dukedom behind them. Lord Wyndham did not contest it publicly. To do so would have required him to explain the original terms of the agreement, and those terms, examined in full daylight, did not reflect well on any of the choices he had made. He withdrew from the conversation the way powerful men often withdraw from battles they have quietly lost, into silence and the pretense that the entire matter had never been particularly important to him. Portia remained at Mrs. Crane's house for 2 weeks. Her father sent no word and made no demands, which Mrs. Crane said was either an act of dignity or an act of strategy, and probably both. At the end of the 2nd week, a cousin of Portia's mother arrived from Edinburgh, a warm and practical woman named Mrs. Delia Forsyth, who had received a letter from Mrs. Crane and had come down on the first available coach without hesitation. Portia left with her, and when she said goodbye to me in Mrs. Crane's entrance hall, she held my hands for a moment and said, "I hope he deserves you." Then she smiled, which was the first real smile I had seen from her, and it made her look entirely different, lighter, like something long held down had been allowed to surface. Then she was gone. I went back to the shop on Calloway Lane. The window had been replaced, paid for before I even arrived, by a craftsman who had been sent without announcement and had simply done the work and left. Mrs. Galloway accepted this without comment, which from her was the highest form of approval. I tried to return to ordinary life. I took in orders. I worked on buttonholes and hems. I trained Bets, who turned out to have a remarkable natural instinct for fine stitch work, and I told her so, which made her go red to the ears. I had tea with Mrs. Galloway in the evenings and did not talk about the things I was thinking about. The embroidery, the ivory silk with its pencil lines of flowers, was still at the Mayfair house. I had left it unfinished in the upheaval of everything, and that fact sat in the back of my mind with a particular insistence, because I do not leave work unfinished, and because the embroidery was not entirely about the work anymore, and I knew it. A week passed. Then Mr. Ventry appeared at the shop door on a Wednesday afternoon, with an expression that was as calm as ever, but had something underneath it, something that might, on a less composed face, have been called anticipation. He asked if I might be available to return to the Mayfair house. He said the commission remained incomplete. He said His Grace had asked him to convey that there was no pressure and no expectation, and that if Miss Brewster preferred not to return, her payment would be sent in full regardless. I put down the hem I was working on. I looked at Mr. Ventry. "Tell him I will come tomorrow," I said. I went that evening instead. The Mayfair house was quieter than before. Mr. Ventry let me in and took me upstairs without comment. The sitting room was exactly as I had left it. The frame in the window, the ivory silk, the pencil lines of flowers waiting with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time already. The thread case beside it, still sorted with the same obsessive care. I sat down. I threaded a needle. I began to work from the center outward, the way the pattern required, the way my father had taught me. I heard him in the doorway before he spoke. "You came early," he said. "The work was calling me." He came into the room and stood near the window the way he always did, looking out at the street below. The late afternoon light came in golden and long, and in it the room looked like something from a painting, and he looked like the kind of man you are not supposed to trust yourself to feel things about. I kept my eyes on the silk, "How is Mrs. Galloway?" he asked. "Formidable, as always." "And Bets?" Discovering she has talent and trying very hard not to show how pleased she is about it, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thomasine." It was the first time he had used my given name, not Miss Brewster, my name. He said it the way you say something you have been waiting to say for long enough that it feels different, finally coming out. I looked up. He had turned from the window. He was looking at me with all of it visible. No armor, no careful management, no performance. Just him, standing in the golden light of his own sitting room, looking at a seamstress from Calloway Lane like she was the most specific and necessary thing he had encountered in his entire adult life. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need to say it clearly, without the complication of circumstance or pressure or anything else. I need to say it because it is true, and I have been not saying it for reasons that no longer apply." I set down the needle. "I am not a simple man," he said. "I know that. I carry my father's mistakes and my mother's grief, and 20 years of being exactly what everyone needed me to be in any given room, and I am aware that that is not a comfortable thing to walk toward." He paused. "But I have spent 3 weeks in the presence of a woman who threw her shoe at me, which is not something that happens to me often, and who looked at a piece of silk my mother designed and saw immediately what 3 trained embroiderers had missed, and who told me I had cruelty for a man with my reputation, and who was right, and who made me want to be less of the things I have always been and more of the things I have never let myself try to be. The room was so quiet I could hear the thread against the silk when a breeze moved through the window. "I am asking you," he said, "if there is any possibility that you would consider allowing me to court you properly, formally, with every intention that it matters." He stopped. Then, quieter. "Because you already matter, considerably, and I would rather say so plainly than spend any more time finding reasons not to." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about Mrs. Galloway's warning, about the current that takes you somewhere you did not intend to go. I thought about the locked gate in the cold garden, and the card with the address, and a shoe sailing through a gilded ballroom and landing at the feet of a man who responded to it not with anger, but with curiosity. I thought about a piece of ivory silk that a mother designed for a love she hoped her son would choose freely. "Yes," I said, "I would consider it." He let out a breath. Not dramatic, just real, just honest. And then, slowly, carefully, like a man who wanted to do this thing correctly, he smiled. Not the smirk from the ballroom. Something entirely different. Something that had no performance in it at all. He walked to the chair across from my embroidery frame and sat down. He picked up a small book that had been resting on the side table and opened it. And we stayed in that room together, him reading and me stitching, as the afternoon light moved across the silk and the flowers grew slowly outward from the center, the way the pattern had always been meant to go. The courtship was not quiet. London made sure of that. Lady Harriet, having made her choice of allegiance clear in Mrs. Crane's sitting room, threw herself into supporting it with the energy of a woman compensating for 20 years of choosing the wrong side. She appeared at the shop on Calloway Lane one morning in full visiting regalia and presented herself to Mrs. Galloway as though meeting a dignitary, and Mrs. Galloway received her with exactly the same formality, and the two of them sat across from each other for an hour and drank tea and reached some private understanding that neither of them ever explained to anyone else, but which seemed to settle every potential objection before it could be raised. Mrs. Crane hosted a small dinner where I was introduced to several people as a close friend of the family, which was what Mrs. Crane called everything she wanted to make legitimate before it officially was. Mr. Ventry, who I had come to understand was the most quietly important person in the Duke's life, told me one afternoon with his characteristic understatement that he thought things were going well, and coming from him, that was equivalent to anyone else setting off fireworks. Society talked. Of course it did. A duke and a seamstress. Tongues would have wagged over that for years, even without a shoe involved. But the shoe had made it a story, and stories in London have a way of becoming their own kind of protection when they are told often enough and well enough, and this one was told often. Lady Harriet made certain of that. She had an extraordinary gift for controlling a narrative, while appearing to simply be sharing charming gossip, and she deployed it ruthlessly and effectively on our behalf. Lord Wyndham made no further moves. His daughter was in Edinburgh, beyond his reach. His document was void. His leverage was gone. He retreated into his clubs and his silences, and the city moved on, which is what the city always does. The embroidery was finished on a Thursday morning in early spring. I set down my needle and looked at it in the window light, the flowers growing outward from the center just as the pencil lines had always intended. The color and weight of it exactly what it should be, and I felt the satisfaction of completed work alongside something deeper and quieter, the sense of something restored. A woman who had drawn these lines and never seen them filled had wanted something whole for her son. It was whole now. I was still looking at it when he came into the room. He saw my face before he saw the silk. Then he looked at the frame. He stood very still for a long moment, and I did not look at him because some things deserve privacy, and a man looking at his mother's finished work is one of them. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but the steadiness was working hard. "It is exactly right," he said. "Your mother knew what she was doing," I said. "Yes," he said. "She did." He proposed 6 days later, in the same sitting room, with no audience and no ceremony, and the embroidery frame still in the window behind him. He went down on one knee, which he said felt slightly absurd, but which he intended to do correctly regardless, and he looked up at me and said, "I would very much like you to be my wife, Thomasine. Not because circumstances require it, or family pressure demands it, or London expects anything at all. Because I choose it. Because I choose you." I said yes. Mrs. Galloway cried, which she denied immediately, and with great conviction. Betts clapped her hands over her mouth. Mrs. Crane said she had known since the morning I first appeared on her doorstep with one shoe that had been sniffed by a duke, and the expression of a woman who did not yet know what she had started. Mr. Ventry shook my hand and said he was very glad, which from him felt like a great deal. We were married in late spring, in a church that was smaller than the occasion probably required, but exactly the right size for the people who mattered. Lady Harriet wore something magnificent and spent the entire ceremony looking quietly triumphant. Mrs. Crane brought flowers from her own garden. Portia sent a letter from Edinburgh that arrived the day before, and in it she said she wished us happiness without qualification, and that she had recently met a very agreeable man at her cousin's neighbor's dinner party, and would I please not let London forget about her entirely. I walked into that church as Thomasine Brewster, daughter of a tailor from Calloway Lane, and I walked out as the Duchess of Ashenvale, and the distance between those two things was one ballroom, one terrible remark, one thrown shoe, one dark and dangerous pair of eyes, and one smirk that I had thought was the beginning of my worst night, and had turned out to be the beginning of everything else. Outside the church, in the spring sunshine, with the sound of the city around us, and his hand warm over mine, he leaned down and said quietly, close to my ear, "I should tell you, I still have the shoe. I pulled back and looked at him. You kept it. Naturally. That is very strange behavior, Your Grace. You threw it at my face, he said. I think strange behavior is evenly distributed in this marriage. I laughed, which was something I had not expected to do, standing on the steps of a church in a good gown with half of London watching. But I laughed, and he smiled, that real and unguarded smile with nothing performed in it, and he tucked my hand more firmly into his arm, and we walked down the steps and into the ordinary, extraordinary life that a shoe, of all things, had made possible. Now, before you go, tell me this. If someone humiliated you in front of a room full of people, would you have thrown the shoe? Drop your answer in the comments and let us know where you are watching from. If this story has been pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button, because we have so many more stories just like this one waiting for you. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next.